The morning sun cast long shadows across the suburban street as Sarah Martinez stepped out of the taxi, her worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The house looked exactly the same as it had 15 years ago, down to the faded blue paint on the shutters and the crooked mailbox her father had never bothered to fix. She stood there for a long moment, her hand instinctively moving to touch the scar that ran along her left temple, a reminder of that terrible night when everything changed. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the distant sound of a lawnmower breaking the peaceful silence. Sarah had chosen Tuesday morning specifically for this reason. Fewer people would be around to stare, to whisper, to remember the scared 17-year-old girl who had fled this place with nothing but the clothes on her back and promises she would never return. But here she was, 32 years old and wearing the desert combat boots that had carried her through 3 deployments in Afghanistan. The weight of her military gear felt reassuring against her body, a stark contrast to the vulnerability she had felt the last time she walked down this street. Mrs. Henderson from next door was watering her garden, the same woman who had watched through her kitchen window on that awful night 15 years ago. Their eyes met across the fence, and Sarah saw the recognition dawn on the older woman's face. The garden hose slipped from Mrs. Henderson's grip, water pooling on the concrete driveway as she stared in shock. Sarah nodded politely and continued toward the front door. She had practiced this moment 1,000 times during her military service, imagining what she would say, how she would feel. The reality was different from her rehearsals. Her heart pounded steadily, but it was the controlled rhythm of someone who had learned to manage fear and uncertainty through discipline and training. The key was exactly where her mother had always hidden it, under the 3rd flower pot from the left on the front porch. Some things never changed in small towns. Sarah picked up the dusty key and noticed her hands remained steady. 3 tours of duty had taught her to function under pressure, and this homecoming was just another mission to complete. Inside, the house smelled like old furniture and her mother's lavender air freshener. Dust particles danced in the afternoon light, streaming through the living room windows. Everything was smaller than she remembered, but that was normal. The eyes of a child saw the world differently than those of a battle-tested soldier. Family photos still lined the mantelpiece above the fireplace, but Sarah noticed that several pictures had been removed. The empty spaces on the wood told their own story. She moved closer and realized that every photo containing her image had been taken down. Her high school graduation picture, family Christmas photos, even the silly snapshot of her and her younger brother Tommy building a snowman in the backyard. The sound of footsteps on the front porch made her turn toward the door. Through the window, she could see her brother Tommy approaching, now a grown man of 27 with the same dark hair and brown eyes they had inherited from their father. He moved with purpose, his face set in hard lines that reminded Sarah of their father's expression during his worst moments. Tommy pushed through the front door without knocking, stopping short when he saw Sarah standing in the living room. For several seconds, neither sibling spoke. The last time they had been in the same room, Tommy had been 12 years old, crying as he watched their house burn while Sarah was loaded into an ambulance. "Mom said you were coming back," Tommy said finally, his voice flat and carefully controlled. "I told her you wouldn't have a nerve." Sarah studied her brother's face, noting the way his jaw muscles tensed and how his hands curled into loose fists at his sides. These were signs she had learned to read in hostile environments, indicators of aggression that could precede violence. But this was her little brother, not an enemy combatant. "Hello, Tommy," she replied, keeping her voice calm and even. "You look good. Healthy." "Don't," Tommy said sharply. "Don't act like we're friends catching up. You lost that right when you left us to deal with the aftermath of what you did." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from an old fire. Sarah had expected this confrontation, had prepared for it during the long flight home from her final deployment. She understood Tommy's anger, even agreed with some of it. Her choices 15 years ago had consequences that rippled through her family's life long after she was gone. "Where is Mom?" Sarah asked, choosing not to engage with Tommy's anger directly. She had learned in the military that some battles were not worth fighting, especially when the outcome would not change the larger mission. "She's at work," Tommy replied, "at the diner on Main Street. Same job she's had since Dad died, working double shifts to keep this house because she always believed you'd come home someday." The mention of their father's death hit Sarah harder than she had expected. She had received the news during her second deployment, delivered by her commanding officer in a brief, formal conversation outside the mess tent. There had been no opportunity to come home for the funeral, no chance to say goodbye or make peace with the man whose drinking and violent temper had shaped so much of her childhood. "When did he die?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. 6 years ago, Tommy said. "Liver failure. Mom held his hand at the hospital, and he asked for you right at the end. Called your name over and over until he couldn't speak anymore." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with suppressed emotions. In the military, there was always another mission, another objective to focus on when personal feelings threatened to overwhelm. But here, in this house full of memories and ghosts, she had nowhere to redirect her attention. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," she said, and meant it. Tommy's expression softened slightly, but the anger remained in his eyes. "Sorry doesn't help Mom pay the mortgage or deal with the neighbors who still whisper about what happened that night. Sorry doesn't fix the fact that I grew up without my big sister because she was too much of a coward to face what she had done." The word coward struck deep, challenging the very foundation of the person Sarah had become. She had earned 3 commendations for valor, had led soldiers through combat situations where courage was the difference between life and death. But, in her brother's eyes, she was still the scared teenager who had run away rather than face the consequences of a moment of poor judgment that had changed everything. "I joined the Army," Sarah said quietly. "I served my country for 12 years. I've done things that required more courage than I thought I had." "Congratulations," Tommy replied with bitter sarcasm. "You found your courage somewhere else. Too bad you couldn't find it here when we needed you." The front door opened again, and their mother stepped inside. Elena Martinez looked older than her 54 years, with gray streaking her dark hair and deep lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and hard work. She stopped in the doorway, looking back and forth between her 2 children as if she could not quite believe they were both standing in her living room. "Mija," she whispered, using the Spanish endearment she had called Sarah since childhood. Sarah felt her careful emotional control waver as her mother rushed forward and wrapped her in a fierce embrace. Elena was smaller than Sarah remembered, her bones feeling fragile beneath her work uniform. The smell of coffee and bacon clung to her mother's clothes, reminders of the long shifts at the diner that had supported their family for years. "I knew you'd come back," Elena said, her voice thick with tears. "I always knew my girl would come home." Over her mother's shoulder, Sarah could see Tommy watching them with a mixture of resentment and pain. The family reunion he had imagined for years was finally happening, but it was not bringing the closure or healing he had hoped for. "Why now?" Tommy asked. "Why come back after all this time?" Sarah gently extracted herself from her mother's embrace, needing the physical space to think clearly. The question deserved an honest answer, even if the truth was complicated. "Because I'm finally ready," she said. "Because I spent 12 years learning who I am and what I'm capable of. Because running away didn't solve anything, and I owe this family and this community the truth about what happened that night." Elena's face went pale at the mention of that night. For 15 years, they had all avoided talking about the details, as if silence could somehow erase the memory of flames and sirens and the screaming that had echoed through the neighborhood. "The Calderon family still lives here," Elena said quietly. "Maria Calderon never speaks to me anymore. She crosses the street when she sees me coming." Sarah nodded, having expected this information. The Calderon family had lost their home and nearly their lives because of her actions. Their forgiveness was not something she could demand or expect, but she could at least offer a proper apology and take responsibility for the pain she had caused. "I need to see them," Sarah said. "I need to make things right." As much as that's possible. Tommy laughed harshly. Make things right? You think showing up in your soldier costume is going to fix what you broke? You think saying sorry is going to give the Calderons back their house, or give Mrs. Calderon back her peace of mind? No, sarà riplaida honestly. I think some things can be fixed. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't try to do what I can. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Elena moved to answer it, revealing a tall man in a police uniform. Officer James Rodriguez had been a rookie cop 15 years ago, one of the first responders on the night of the fire. Now he wore sergeant stripes and carried himself with the confidence of an experienced law enforcement officer. Mrs. Martinez, he said politely, then looked directly at Sarah. Miss Martinez, I heard you were back in town. Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah replied, recognizing him despite the years that had changed his appearance. I was planning to stop by the station later today. I'm sure you were, Rodriguez said, his tone neutral but watchful. Mind if I come in? I think we should have a conversation about your plans while you're here. Elena stepped aside to let him enter, though her face showed worry about having a police officer in her living room. The last time Rodriguez had been in their house, he had been asking questions about arson and conducting interviews about the events leading up to the fire. I'm not here to cause any trouble, Sarah said as Rodriguez settled into their father's old armchair. I came back to face what I did and try to make amends. That's admirable, Rodriguez replied. But you need to understand that your return has already caused a stir in the community. Mrs. Calderon called the station this morning in a panic. She saw you walking down the street, and it brought back a lot of difficult memories for her. Sarah felt a stab of guilt. She had hoped to approach the Calderon family on her own terms, after she had time to prepare what she wanted to say. Instead, her mere presence in the neighborhood had already caused them distress. I understand her reaction, Sarah said. What I did was unforgivable, but I'm not the same person I was 15 years ago. Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, taking in the military bearing and the confident way she met his gaze. You've changed, I'll give you that. The scared kid I interviewed back then wouldn't have looked me in the eye for more than a few seconds. The Army taught me a lot about responsibility and accountability, Sarah said. I learned that running away from your mistakes doesn't make them disappear. The statute of limitations has run out, Rodriguez said. You can't be prosecuted for what happened that night. But that doesn't mean everyone in this town has forgotten or forgiven. Tommy spoke up from where he stood near the window. Maybe she should have stayed away. Maybe some things are better left in the past. That's not your decision to make, Elena said firmly, speaking to her son with a mother's authority. This is Sarah's home too, and she has every right to be here. The room fell silent as the family dynamics played out in front of Rodriguez. He had seen similar situations before, families torn apart by tragedy and poor choices struggling to find their way back to each other across years of pain and resentment. I'm going to be straight with you, Sarah, Rodriguez said. A lot of people in this town think you got away with something. They believe you should have faced consequences for your actions, and they're not happy to see you back here wearing a uniform like some kind of war hero. I'm not a hero, Sarah replied quietly. I'm just someone who finally learned how to take responsibility for her actions. Rodriguez nodded slowly. I hope that's true, because if you're here to make amends, you're going to need all the courage and maturity you can muster. This town has a long memory, and forgiveness doesn't come easy. After Rodriguez left, the three family members sat in uncomfortable silence. The weight of the past hung heavy in the air, along with the uncertainty of what would come next. Sarah could see the exhaustion in her mother's face, the result of years spent defending a daughter who was not there to defend herself. I should have come back sooner, Sarah said. I should have faced this years ago instead of letting you carry the burden alone. Elena reached over and took her daughter's hand. You weren't ready then. Maybe you needed those years in the Army to become strong enough to handle this. Or maybe I was just a selfish coward who let fear control my life, Sarah replied, echoing Tommy's earlier accusation. You were 17, Elena said firmly. You made a mistake that had terrible consequences, but you were still just a child trying to deal with something too big for anyone to handle alone. Tommy stood up abruptly, his frustration boiling over. Stop making excuses for her, Mom. She was old enough to know better, old enough to understand that her actions had consequences. And when those consequences got too scary, she ran. Where are you going? Elena asked as Tommy headed for the door. Out, he replied curtly. I need some air. I need time to process the fact that my sister thinks she can just waltz back into our lives and fix everything with an apology and a military uniform. The door slammed behind him, leaving Sarah and Elena alone in the living room. Through the window, Sarah could see neighbors gathering on their porches and in their yards, drawn by the unusual activity at the Martinez house. Word was spreading quickly through the small community that Sarah had returned. He's angry, Elena said unnecessarily. He has a right to be, Sarah replied. I abandoned both of you when you needed me most. I'll let you deal with the aftermath while I built a new life somewhere else. You were protecting yourself, Elena said. There's no shame in that. But Sarah was no longer sure that self-preservation justified the pain she had caused her family. 12 years of military service had taught her about duty and sacrifice, about putting the needs of others before your own comfort and safety. She had learned these lessons too late to help the people who mattered most. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah helped her mother prepare dinner, falling back into old rhythms despite the years that had passed. Elena talked about her job at the diner, about the regular customers, and the small dramas of small-town life. She carefully avoided mentioning the fire or the years of speculation and gossip that had followed Sarah's departure. When Tommy returned at sunset, his anger had cooled into a resigned acceptance. He sat at the dinner table across from Sarah, studying her face as if trying to reconcile his memories of his sister with the woman who had taken her place. Tell me about the army, he said finally. Tell me what you did over there. Sarah chose her words carefully, knowing that her brother was looking for evidence of the person she had become. She talked about her training, about the responsibility of leading soldiers in dangerous situations, about the lessons she had learned about leadership and courage under pressure. Did you kill anyone? Tommy asked bluntly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah met her brother's gaze steadily, understanding that her answer would shape his opinion of her transformation. Yes, she said simply. I did what was necessary to protect my soldiers and complete our missions. Tommy nodded slowly, processing this information. The sister he remembered had been unable to handle the consequences of a single poor decision. The woman sitting across from him had made life and death choices in combat situations. Are you different now? He asked. Really different, but just older? Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. I'm different in the ways that matter. I understand responsibility now. I know that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. Then, why did it take you 15 years to come back? Tommy asked. If you learned all these lessons about courage and responsibility, why didn't you use them to face what you did here? The question cut to the heart of Sarah's guilt and self-doubt. She had asked herself the same thing countless times during her final months of military service, as she prepared to return home and confront her past. Because I was still afraid, she admitted. Because facing combat is easier than facing the people you've hurt. Because I knew that coming back here would be the hardest thing I'd ever done. Elena reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. But you're here now. That's what matters. As they finished dinner, Sarah realized that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult process. She had taken the first step by coming home, but the real work lay ahead. She would have to face the Calderon family, confront the community's anger and suspicion, and find a way to rebuild relationships that had been shattered by her choices. The weight of her combat gear felt different now, less like armor and more like a reminder of the strength she had discovered within herself. She would need every bit of that strength in the days to come, as she worked to prove that the scared teenager who had fled in the night had truly become someone worthy of forgiveness and redemption. Outside, the streetlights were coming on, casting the same warm glow over the neighborhood that Sarah remembered from her childhood. But everything else had changed, including herself. The woman who sat at her mother's dinner table was not the same person who had left 15 years ago, and proving that difference would require more courage than any battle she had faced in Afghanistan. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult conversations. Tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Sarah Martinez was home. Sarah woke before dawn, her internal clock still set to military time despite being back in civilian surroundings. The house was quiet except for the familiar creaking of old wood settling in the morning cool. She lay in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still clung to the plaster, faded but persistent after all these years. Through her bedroom window, she could see the Calderon house 3 doors down. The structure was different now, rebuilt after the fire with modern materials and a different layout. The cheerful yellow paint and neat landscaping could not hide the fact that this was not the original home, not the place where Maria Calderon had raised her 3 children and tended her famous rose garden. Sarah dressed quietly in civilian clothes, choosing simple jeans and a plain sweater rather than anything that would draw attention to her military background. Today was about facing her past as the person she had been, not hiding behind the identity she had built in the Army. The kitchen was empty, but Elena had left coffee brewing and a note saying she had gone to work early. Tommy's bedroom door was closed, and Sarah could hear him snoring softly. Some things never changed. Her younger brother had always been a heavy sleeper, able to sleep through thunderstorms and neighborhood emergencies alike. Sarah poured herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. She had witnessed countless sunrises during her military service, often while standing guard duty or preparing for morning patrols. But this sunrise felt different, weighted with the knowledge of what she had to do. At 7:30, she saw Maria Calderon emerge from her rebuilt home to collect the morning newspaper. The woman moved slowly, favoring her left leg where she had been injured during her escape from the fire 15 years ago. Her once dark hair was now completely gray, pulled back in the same simple ponytail she had worn for as long as Sarah could remember. Sarah finished her coffee and walked outside, her heart pounding with the same intensity she had felt before her first combat mission. Approaching Maria Calderon would require more courage than facing enemy fire, because this time she could not rely on training and tactics to guide her through the encounter. Maria looked up as Sarah approached, her face cycling through recognition, shock, and then a carefully controlled mask of neutrality. She clutched the newspaper against her chest like a shield, her dark eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Hello, Mrs. Calderon," Sarah said quietly, stopping several feet away to avoid making the older woman feel cornered or threatened. "Sarah Martinez," Maria replied, her accent still thick after decades in America. "I wondered if I would see you before you left town again." The words stung, but Sarah had expected hostility. She had rehearsed this conversation many times, but the reality was more difficult than her imagination had prepared her for. "I'm not leaving this time," Sarah said. "I came back to stay, to face what I did, and try to make things right." Maria laughed bitterly. "Make things right? You think there's a way to make right what you took from my family? You think your words can give me back my home, my photographs, my mother's wedding dress?" Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with suppressed emotions. In Afghanistan, she had learned to compartmentalize feelings that could interfere with mission effectiveness. But here, facing the woman whose life she had forever altered, emotional control felt like cowardice rather than strength. "No," Sarah said honestly. "I can't give back what you lost. I can't undo the damage I caused or take away the pain you've carried all these years. But I can tell you the truth about what happened that night, and I can accept responsibility for my actions." Maria studied Sarah's face intently, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. "The truth? You want to tell me the truth now, after 15 years of silence?" "I was 17 and terrified," Sarah said. "I made a stupid decision that had consequences I never imagined. I was angry at my father, angry at the world, and I thought I could hurt him by destroying something he cared about. I never meant for the fire to spread to your house. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke. Maria's face showed no change in expression, but Sarah could see tears forming in the older woman's eyes. "My grandson asked me why our family pictures start when he was 5 years old," Maria said quietly. "He wants to know about his grandfather who died 2 years before the fire, wants to see photos of his mother as a little girl. I have to tell him that a fire took all of those memories away." Sarah felt each word like a physical blow. The abstract concept of property damage took on human dimensions when seen through the eyes of a family trying to rebuild their history from nothing. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to say them anyway. "I'm sorry for what I took from you, for the pain I caused, for the years of silence when you deserved answers and accountability." "Sorry," Maria repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "My husband never recovered from that night. He spent 5 years jumping at every sound, checking the doors and windows 10 times before bed, afraid to sleep because he might not wake up in time to save us. The doctor said his heart attack was caused by stress and anxiety. I say it was caused by you." The accusation hit Sarah harder than enemy gunfire. She had known about the fire and the injuries, but she had never considered the long-term psychological damage her actions had inflicted on the survivors. Maria's husband had died because of trauma Sarah had caused, making her responsible for more than property damage and physical injuries. "I didn't know about your husband's death," Sarah said. "I should have known. I should have been here to face the consequences of what I did instead of leaving you to deal with it alone." "Yes," Maria agreed. "You should have been here. You should have faced what you did instead of running away like a coward." Sarah accepted the harsh words without defending herself. She had been a coward, and no amount of military service could change that fundamental truth about her teenage self. "Can you ever forgive me?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer was likely no. Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone trying to see into her soul. "Forgiveness is not something you can ask for," she said finally. "It is something that comes when the heart is ready, if it ever is ready. Right now, my heart is still too full of anger and grief." Sarah nodded, understanding that forgiveness was not something she could demand or expect. "Is there anything I can do? Anything that would help you or your family?" "You can stay away from us," Maria said flatly. "You can let us live our lives without the constant reminder of what we lost. That would be a kindness." The request felt like a slap, but Sarah recognized it as a reasonable boundary. Her presence would naturally cause pain to people who had worked hard to rebuild their lives after her destructive actions. "I understand," Sarah said. "I won't bother you again unless you want me to." She turned to leave, but Maria's voice stopped her. "Wait," the older woman said. "There is something you should know. Your father came to see me after you left town. He was drunk, as usual, but he was also crying. He said he knew the fire was his fault because of how he treated you, because of the anger he put in your heart." Sarah turned back, surprised by this revelation. Her father had never been one to accept responsibility for his actions, preferring to blame others for the consequences of his drinking and violence. "He said he was going to get sober," Maria continued. "He said he owed it to our families to become a better man. He tried for a while, went to meetings, stopped drinking for almost 6 months. But the guilt was too much for him. He started drinking again, heavier than before." The information painted a different picture of her father's final years than Sarah had imagined. She had assumed he continued his destructive behavior unchanged, never considering that her actions might have triggered a period of self-reflection and attempted reform. "Thank you for telling me," Sarah said. "I needed to know that." Maria nodded curtly and turned back toward her house, their conversation clearly over. Sarah watched her climb the steps to her front door, noting how the older woman's movements showed the lingering effects of her injuries. Another consequence of that terrible night that could never be undone. Sarah spent the rest of the morning walking through the neighborhood, reacquainting herself with streets and landmarks that had changed significantly during her absence. The elementary school where she had learned to read now had a new playground and a modern computer lab visible through the windows. The corner store where she had bought candy with her allowance had been replaced by a coffee shop that would not have looked out of place in a much larger city. Change was inevitable, Sarah realized, but not all change was progress. Some changes were forced by circumstances beyond anyone's control, like the Calderon family having to rebuild their home and their lives because of her reckless actions. At noon, she found herself standing outside Roberto's garage, where she had once worked part-time during high school. Roberto Valdez had been like a surrogate father to her, teaching her about car engines and life with equal patience. The garage looked exactly the same, down to the faded Coca-Cola sign hanging next to the service bay. Sarah pushed open the door, setting off the same bell that had announced customers 15 years ago. Roberto emerged from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair completely gray now, but his smile was exactly the same. "Sarah Martinez," he said, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Look at you, all grown up and wearing soldier's boots." "Hello, Roberto," Sarah said, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. Here was someone who seemed genuinely happy to see her, without judgment or anger coloring their reaction. "I heard you were back in town," Roberto said, coming around the counter to embrace her in a hug that smelled like motor oil and coffee. "Folks have been talking about nothing else since yesterday." "I imagine they have," Sarah replied. "Not all of it good, I'm sure." Roberto studied her face with the keen observation of someone who had spent years reading people as well as engines. "You look different, stronger, more sure of yourself." "The Army will do that," Sarah said, "assuming it doesn't break you first." "And you weren't broken," Roberto observed. "It was not a question." "Close," Sarah admitted, "but not broken." Roberto nodded, as if this confirmed something he had always believed about her. "You were always tougher than you knew. Even as a kid, you had steel inside you. You just needed to find it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, a man Sarah recognized as David Calderon, Maria's eldest son. He had been away at college during the fire, returning home to find his family's life completely upended. Now in his 30s, he carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who had built a successful career despite the challenges of his family's circumstances. David stopped short when he saw Sarah, his face hardening into an expression of cold anger. "I heard you were back," he said. "I was hoping it was just a rumor." Roberto looked between them, clearly sensing the tension, but not understanding its source. "You kids know each other from the old days?" "We know each other," David replied, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "Sarah Martinez is the reason my family lost everything 15 years ago." The revelation hit Roberto like a physical blow. Sarah could see the moment when he connected her military bearing with the scared teenager who had fled town after the fire. His expression shifted from warmth to shock to something that might have been disappointment. "You're the one who started the fire," Roberto said quietly. It was not a question. "Yes," Sarah replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze directly. "I am." David stepped closer, his hands clenched in a fist at his sides. "Do you have any idea what you did to my family? Do you know that my mother still has nightmares about that night? That she can't sleep in a room without checking the exits first?" Sarah felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack. "I spoke with your mother this morning. I tried to apologize, but I know that words can't undo the damage I caused." "You spoke with my mother?" David's voice rose with anger. "You had the nerve to approach my mother and bring back all those terrible memories?" "I needed her to know that I take responsibility for what happened," Sarah said, maintaining her composure despite David's aggression. "I needed her to know that I never intended for anyone to get hurt." "Intentions don't matter," David snapped. "Results matter. And the result is that you destroyed my family's life and then disappeared while we dealt with the consequences." Roberto moved between them, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating confrontation in his garage. "Maybe we should all calm down and talk about this like adults." "There's nothing to talk about," David said. "This woman is a coward who came back to town thinking she could make herself feel better with empty apologies. She doesn't care about the damage she caused. She just wants to ease her own guilt. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to hurt. Sarah had to ask herself whether her return was motivated by genuine remorse or by a selfish desire to feel better about her past actions. "You're right," she said quietly. "Part of this is about my own guilt, but it's also about accepting responsibility for what I did and trying to do whatever I can to help your family heal." "We don't need your help," David replied coldly. "We rebuilt our lives without you, and we can continue living without you. The best thing you can do for my family is to leave town and never come back." "I can't do that," Sarah said. "I won't run away again." David's anger flared hotter. "Then, you're even more selfish than I thought. You're going to force my family to relive their trauma just so you can feel like you've done the right thing." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Rodriguez, who had apparently been called to respond to reports of a disturbance at the garage. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the confrontation, introducing an element of official authority that made everyone more careful with their words and actions. "Gentlemen, Miss Martinez," Rodriguez said professionally. "I got a call about raised voices and wanted to make sure everything is okay here." "Everything's fine," David said, though his clenched fists suggested otherwise. "Just a conversation between old acquaintances." Rodriguez studied the scene with the trained eye of an experienced police officer, noting the tension in everyone's posture and the way they were positioned relative to each other. "Maybe it would be best if we all took a step back and cooled off." "Good idea," Sarah said, recognizing that her presence was only making the situation worse. "I should go." "You should leave town," David called after her as she headed for the door. "You should go back wherever you came from and leave decent people alone." Sarah paused at the door, but did not turn around. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else." Outside the garage, Sarah found herself shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and suppressed emotion. The confrontation had gone worse than she had expected, revealing depths of anger and resentment that she had not fully anticipated. Rodriguez followed her outside, his expression showing concern rather than official suspicion. "You okay? You look pretty shaken up." "I'm fine," Sarah replied automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. I knew coming back would be difficult, but I didn't realize how much pain my presence would cause people who were just trying to live their lives." "Did you expect a warm welcome?" Rodriguez asked with genuine curiosity. "No," Sarah admitted, "but I guess I hoped that 15 years would have been enough time for some of the anger to fade." "I was wrong." Rodriguez leaned against his patrol car, studying Sarah with the same intensity he had shown the previous day. "Can I ask you something? Why did you really come back? And don't give me the speech about responsibility and making amends. I want the real reason." Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I was tired of being defined by the worst thing I ever did. Because I wanted to find out if the person I become is strong enough to face the person I used to be." "And what have you learned so far?" "That some damage can't be repaired," Sarah said. "That good intentions don't erase the consequences of bad actions. That courage is more complicated than I thought it was." Rodriguez nodded as if her answer satisfied something he had been wondering about. "You know, I've been a cop for 18 years now. I've seen a lot of people do terrible things and then spend years trying to justify or minimize what they did. You're not doing that." "Because I can't," Sarah replied. "What I did was inexcusable. I set fire to my father's tool shed because I was angry and wanted to hurt him. The fire spread to the Calderon house, nearly killing an entire family and destroying their home. Those are the facts, and no amount of explanation can change them." "But you were 17, Rodriguez pointed out. "A kid with an alcoholic, abusive father, and no other outlet for your anger." "Being 17 doesn't excuse what I did," Sarah said. "It explains it, maybe, but it doesn't excuse it." Rodriguez pushed himself off his patrol car, preparing to leave. "For what it's worth, I think you've changed. The scared kid I interviewed 15 years ago could barely string two sentences together without breaking down. You got strength now, backbone. Whatever you did in the army, it made you into a different person. I hope so, Sarah said. But being a different person doesn't undo the damage the old person caused. No, Rodriguez agreed. But it might help you figure out how to live with what you did. And that's something, even if it's not everything. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon at the town library, researching what had happened to her community during her absence. The local newspaper archives painted a picture of a town that had struggled economically, but maintained its close-knit character. Several businesses had closed, but new ones had opened. Young people continued to leave for opportunities in larger cities, but some had returned to raise their own families. The fire that had changed everything was mentioned only briefly in the archives, described as an accidental blaze that had damaged 2 properties before being brought under control by the volunteer fire department. There was no mention of arson charges or criminal investigation, suggesting that the authorities had been unable to prove intent or had chosen not to pursue prosecution of a juvenile offender. Sarah found herself wondering what would have happened if she had stayed to face the consequences of her actions. Would she have been charged with a crime? Would she have spent time in juvenile detention? Would the community have been more forgiving if she had immediately accepted responsibility instead of fleeing in the night? These questions had no answers, but they highlighted the impossibility of undoing the past or changing the choices that had shaped the present. Sarah had to work with the situation as it existed now, not as it might have been if she had acted differently 15 years ago. As evening approached, Sarah walked home through streets that felt both familiar and foreign. Porch lights were coming on in houses where families were gathering for dinner, living the quiet, ordinary lives that she had disrupted with her reckless actions. The normalcy of it all made her feel like an intruder, someone whose presence threatened the peace that the community had worked hard to rebuild. At home, she found Elena and Tommy waiting for her in the living room, their faces showing concern and exhaustion. Word of her confrontations with Maria and David Calderon had apparently spread quickly through the small town's gossip network. People have been calling all day, Elena said without preamble. Some angry, some curious, some just wanting to know if the rumors are true. What did you tell them? Sarah asked, settling into the chair across from her family. The truth, Elena replied, that my daughter served her country with honor and came home to face her past with courage. Tommy snorted derisively. That's one way to spin it. Another way would be to say that she came back to town to reopen old wounds and force people to relive their trauma. That's not what I intended, Sarah said. Maybe not, Tommy replied. But that's what's happening. David Calderon called me this afternoon. He wants to know if there's any way to get a restraining order to keep you away from his family. The news hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. The idea that her presence was so threatening that legal action was being considered made her question everything about her decision to return home. Maybe he's right, she said quietly. Maybe I should leave. No, Elena said firmly. This is your home. You have a right to be here. Rights don't matter if exercising them causes more harm than good, Sarah replied. I came back to make amends, not to cause more pain. Tommy leaned forward in his chair, studying his sister's face with new intensity. So what are you going to do? Run away again? The question was a challenge, and Sarah recognized it as such. Tommy was testing her resolve, trying to determine whether she had truly changed or was still the same person who had chosen flight over fight when things got difficult. I don't know, Sarah admitted. I thought I had it all figured out, but I didn't anticipate how much my presence would hurt people who were just trying to live their lives in peace. Maybe that's the real test, Tommy said. Not whether you can face up to what you did, but whether you can stick it out when facing up to it gets uncomfortable. Elena reached over and took Sarah's hand. Whatever you decide, Mija will support you. But don't let other people's anger drive you away from the home you have a right to claim. As the family sat together in the gathering darkness, Sarah realized that her homecoming had raised more questions than it had answered. She had thought that accepting responsibility and offering apologies would be enough to begin the healing process, but the reality was much more complex. The woman who had returned to town was indeed different from the teenager who had fled 15 years ago. But difference did not automatically translate into redemption, and good intentions did not guarantee positive outcomes. Sarah was discovering that true courage sometimes meant accepting that the right thing to do was not always the thing that made you feel better about yourself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. For tonight, she was home with her family, trying to figure out whether staying and fighting for forgiveness was an act of courage or an exercise in selfishness that would only cause more harm to people who had already suffered enough. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's return, and the town had settled into an uneasy rhythm around her presence. She had found work at Martinez Construction, a company owned by a distant cousin who believed in second chances and needed someone with her organizational skills to help manage job sites. The work was honest and familiar, reminding her of the construction projects she had overseen during her military engineering assignments. Each morning, Sarah walked to work past the Calderon house, maintaining the respectful distance that Maria had requested while silently acknowledging the family whose lives had been forever altered by her actions. The routine had become a form of penance, a daily reminder of the consequences that could never be undone. On this particular Thursday morning, the autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from neighborhood fireplaces, a smell that still made Sarah's stomach tighten with remembered guilt and fear. She was adjusting the straps on her tool belt when she heard shouting coming from the direction of Oak Street, 2 blocks away from the construction site, where her crew was renovating an old Victorian house. The shouting grew louder, accompanied by the sound of running footsteps and car doors slamming. Sarah looked up from the foundation forms she had been inspecting to see thick black smoke rising above the tree line, creating a dark smudge against the bright October sky. "Fire," called out Miguel Santos, the crew foreman who had worked construction for 30 years and had seen every kind of emergency the job could produce. "Looks like a big one." Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her military experience taking over as she assessed the situation. The smoke was too thick and dark to be a controlled burn or a small kitchen fire. This was a structure fire, and from a volume of smoke, it was spreading fast. "Miguel, call 911 and make sure the fire department is on the way," Sarah ordered, her voice carrying the authority she had learned to project in crisis situations. "Everyone else, secure the site and be ready to evacuate if the fire spreads this direction." But even as she issued orders to her crew, Sarah was already running toward the smoke, her steel-toed boots pounding against the sidewalk as muscle memory from 12 years of emergency response training drove her forward. Behind her, Miguel called out warnings about staying safe and letting the professionals handle it, but Sarah was beyond hearing rational advice. The fire was at the Henderson house, the same Mrs. Henderson who had been watering her garden on the day Sarah returned to town. The elderly woman stood in her front yard in her nightgown and slippers, clutching a framed photograph to her chest while flames poured from the windows of her kitchen and began climbing toward the second floor. Sarah reached Mrs. Henderson just as the first fire truck rounded the corner, its sirens adding to the chaos of the scene. Neighbors were gathering at a safe distance, some recording the emergency with their phones while others called out offers of help and places to stay. "Mrs. Henderson, are you hurt?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside the elderly woman who was clearly in shock from the sudden evacuation from her burning home. "My cats," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the flames. "Whiskers and Mittens are still inside. They hide under the bed when they're scared." Sarah looked up at the second-floor windows, where orange light was beginning to flicker behind the glass. The fire department was setting up their equipment, but Sarah knew from experience that interior search and rescue operations took time to organize and execute safely. "Which room?" Sarah asked urgently. "Back bedroom, upstairs," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Please, they're all I have left." Sarah was moving before she had consciously made the decision to act. Her body remembered the weight of combat gear, the feeling of running toward danger instead of away from it. But this time, She was not carrying the equipment that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. She was wearing civilian clothes and construction boots, with nothing but her experience and determination to guide her. The front door was still intact, though smoke was seeping around the frame. Sarah tested the handle and found it unlocked. The hallway beyond was filled with gray smoke that burned her lungs and reduced visibility to just a few feet. She dropped to her hands and knees where the air was marginally clearer and began crawling toward the stairs. Behind her, she could hear the fire department team arriving, their heavy boots and equipment clanging as they prepared for their own entry into the burning structure. Professional firefighters with proper breathing apparatus and protective gear would be better equipped for this rescue, but they would also take precious minutes to organize their approach. Sarah reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up into a tunnel of smoke and heat. The old wooden staircase was still structurally sound, but she could hear the fire eating away at the supports in the walls around her. Every second counted. Taking a deep breath of the relatively clean air near the floor, Sarah began climbing the stairs on her hands and knees, counting steps to track her progress through the blinding smoke. At the top, she turned left toward the back of the house, following Mrs. Henderson's directions while listening for the sound of frightened cats over the roar of the growing fire. The bedroom door was closed, which had helped protect the room from the worst of the smoke. Sarah pushed it open and crawled inside, calling softly for the cats while scanning the room for hiding places. Under the bed, just as Mrs. Henderson had predicted, she found 2 terrified animals cowering against the wall. Whiskers, a large orange tabby, allowed himself to be grabbed and tucked inside Sarah's jacket. Mittens, a smaller black and white cat, required more coaxing before Sarah could secure him as well. Both animals were trembling with fear, but appeared uninjured by smoke or heat. The return trip to the staircase proved more difficult than the entry. The fire had continued to spread during Sarah's rescue mission, and the second floor was now filling rapidly with thick, choking smoke. Sarah could barely see the top of the stairs, and the temperature was rising fast enough to make her skin feel tight and hot. Halfway down the stairs, Sarah heard a loud crack from somewhere in the walls around her. The sound was followed by a shower of sparks and the groaning of stressed lumber. The house was beginning to fail structurally, and she was running out of time to escape safely. At the bottom of the stairs, strong hands grabbed Sarah's shoulders and helped pull her toward the front door. Through smoke-burned eyes, she could see the reflective stripes on a firefighter's jacket and hear a voice shouting instructions she was too disoriented to understand clearly. Outside, Sarah found herself surrounded by paramedics who immediately began checking her vital signs and administering oxygen through a plastic mask. The cats were taken from her jacket by a veterinary technician who had arrived to treat animals affected by the fire. "That was incredibly stupid," said a familiar voice. Sarah looked up to see Sergeant Rodriguez standing beside the ambulance, his face showing a mixture of anger and grudging admiration. "You could have been killed in there." "The cats would have died," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. Mrs. Henderson said they were all she had left. Rodriguez shook his head, but did not argue with her logic. "The fire department was 30 seconds behind you. Professional rescuers with proper equipment." 30 seconds would have been too late, Sarah said, watching as firefighters continued their efforts to save what remained of Mrs. Henderson's home. The crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the fire was larger now, drawn by the drama of the rescue and the sirens of multiple emergency vehicles. Sarah could see familiar faces among the spectators, including David Calderon, who was staring at her with an expression she could not interpret. Mrs. Henderson approached the ambulance, tears streaming down her face as she clutched both cats against her chest. The animals were breathing normally and showed no signs of serious injury from their ordeal. "You saved them," she said to Sarah, her voice breaking with emotion. "You went into that fire and saved my babies." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Sarah replied, uncomfortable with the attention and praise her actions were receiving. "No, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. Not anyone. Most people would have waited for someone else to take the risk. You didn't wait. As the paramedics finished their examination, Sarah became aware that many of the neighbors were looking at her differently than they had for the past 3 weeks. The suspicion and judgment in their faces have been replaced by something that might have been respect, or at least a grudging acknowledgement of her courage. Fire Chief Patricia Wong approached the ambulance, her face serious but not unfriendly. Sarah remembered her as Patty Wong from high school, a girl who had always been serious about her studies and her goals. Now she was clearly serious about her responsibilities as well. That was a brave thing you did, Chief Wong said without preamble. Also incredibly reckless and potentially fatal. If you had been trapped in there, we would have had to risk firefighter lives to rescue you. I understand, Sarah replied. I made a quick decision based on the information I had at the time. Military training? Chief Wong asked. Partly, Sarah admitted. But mostly I just couldn't stand by and let those animals die when I might have been able to save them. Chief Wong studied Sarah for a long moment, then nodded as if she had reached some kind of decision. We're always looking for volunteers at the fire department. People with emergency response experience and the right attitude. If you're interested, come see me when you're feeling better. The offer surprised Sarah, who had not expected any opportunities for community service given the hostility that had greeted her return. I'll think about it, she said. As the emergency crews worked to contain the fire and investigate its cause, neighbors began approaching Sarah to express their gratitude and amazement at her actions. Roberto Valdez was among them, his earlier disappointment apparently forgotten in light of her heroic rescue. That took guts, he said simply. Real guts. Even more surprising was the approach of Maria Calderon, who had been watching the scene from the edge of the crowd. The older woman walked slowly toward the ambulance, her face showing the same careful neutrality she had displayed during their previous encounter. I saw what you did, Maria said quietly. Running into that fire when you could have been hurt or killed. Sarah waited, unsure how to respond to this unexpected contact. My David was here too, Maria continued. He saw you risk your life for someone else's pets. Animals that meant nothing to you personally. They meant everything to Mrs. Henderson, Sarah replied. That was enough. Maria nodded slowly, as if this response confirmed something she had been wondering about. Perhaps we could talk sometime. Not today, when emotions are high, but sometime soon. The offer of communication was more than Sarah had dared hope for. I would like that very much, Mrs. Calderon. Whenever you're ready. After Maria walked away, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts as the paramedics finished their paperwork and the fire department continued their investigation. The Henderson house was a total loss, but no one had been hurt and 2 beloved pets were alive because someone had been willing to take a risk. Tommy arrived at the scene just as Sarah was being cleared to go home, his face showing the same mixture of fear and pride that she had seen in her fellow soldiers when missions went both dangerously and successfully. Mom's going to kill you when she finds out what you did, he said, but his tone was affectionate rather than critical. Probably, Sarah agreed. But Mrs. Henderson's cats are alive. Yeah, Tommy said. They are. As they walked home together, Sarah reflected on how the day had changed everything about her place in the community. For 3 weeks, she had been the outsider, trying to earn forgiveness for past sins. Now she was someone who had risked her own safety to save innocent lives, demonstrating through actions rather than words the person she had become. The fire had given her an opportunity to prove herself in a way that no amount of apologies or explanations could match. She had faced flames again, not as the reckless teenager who had started a destructive blaze, but as a trained adult who used fire as a tool to save rather than destroy. That evening, the story of Sarah's rescue had spread throughout the town's social networks and conversation circles. Elena came home from work with reports that the diner had been buzzing with talk about her daughter's heroic actions. Even customers who had been critical of Sarah's return were now acknowledging her courage and selflessness. People are saying you're a hero, Elena told Sarah as they prepared dinner together. I'm not a hero, Sarah replied. I just did what needed to be done. That's what heroes always say, Elena pointed out with a smile. 3 days later, Sarah received a phone call from David Calderon asking if they could meet at Roberto's garage to continue the conversation that had been interrupted by anger and hostility. She agreed, curious about what had changed his perspective enough to reach out. David was waiting for her when she arrived, sitting on the same chair where his anger had flared 3 weeks earlier. But his posture was different now, less aggressive and more thoughtful. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I was so focused on the person you used to be that I couldn't see the person you had become." "You don't owe me anything," Sarah replied. "Your anger was justified. What I did to your family was unforgivable." "Maybe," David said, "but watching you run into that burning house made me realize that people can change. Really change, not just talk about changing." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of 15 years of anger and resentment beginning to lift from the space between them. "My mother wants to see you," David said finally. "She's been thinking about what you said, about taking responsibility for your actions. She's also been thinking about what she saw at the fire." "What did she see?" Sarah asked. "Someone who ran toward danger to save innocent lives," David replied. "Someone who put other people's safety ahead of her own comfort. Someone who had clearly learned the difference between destructive impulse and constructive courage." A week later, Sarah found herself sitting in Maria Calderon's rebuilt kitchen, sharing coffee and pastries while talking about the past, the present, and the possibility of forgiveness. The conversation was difficult and emotional, but it was also healing in ways that neither woman had expected. "I can't forget what happened that night," Maria said honestly. "The fear, the loss, the years of struggle to rebuild our lives. But I can see that you have learned from your mistakes and become someone who uses her strength to help rather than harm." "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did," Sarah replied. "Not because I expect forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do. Perhaps the best way to make up for past mistakes is to live a life that prevents others from making the same ones," Maria suggested. "To use your experience to help young people who might be facing the same anger and desperation you felt as a teenager." The suggestion planted a seed that would grow into Sarah's eventual decision to volunteer with at-risk youth programs, sharing her story as a cautionary tale while demonstrating that redemption was possible through hard work, accountability, and service to others. 6 months after her return, Sarah had become an accepted member of the community she had once thought lost to her forever. She served as a volunteer firefighter, worked with troubled teenagers through the county's intervention programs, and maintained the respectful relationships she had rebuilt with the people affected by her past actions. The fire that had taken her past had indeed announced her return, but not in the way she had expected. Instead of being defined by the destructive flames she had set as a teenager, she was now known for her willingness to face fire in service of others. The scared girl who had run away had been replaced by a woman who ran toward danger when others needed help. Tommy, watching his sister's integration into the community, admitted that he had been wrong about her motivations for returning. "You didn't come back to make yourself feel better," he said one evening as they shared dinner with Elena. "You came back to make things better, period." "I came back because it was time," Sarah replied. "Because running away doesn't solve anything, and because this community deserved better from me than a lifetime of absence and silence." Elena smiled at her children, seeing in them the family she had always hoped they could become despite the tragedies and mistakes that had nearly torn them apart. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us teach us how to become the best versions of ourselves," she said. "Your father would be proud of both of you." Sarah thought about her father often, wondering if he would indeed be proud of the woman she had become, or if he would simply be relieved that she had found a way to live with the consequences of choices made in anger and desperation. She would never know the answer to that question, but she could honor his memory by continuing to grow and serve and take responsibility for her actions. The flames had taken her past, destroying the innocence and simplicity of her childhood, while forcing her to confront the person she could become when driven by uncontrolled emotion. But Those same flames had forged her into someone stronger, more compassionate, and more committed to using her strength in service of others. Her combat gear had indeed announced her return, but not as a symbol of escape or avoidance. Instead, it represented the discipline, courage, and sense of duty she had developed through military service and brought home to repair what she had broken and build something better from the ashes of her mistakes. Standing in her mother's backyard on a quiet Sunday evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood where she had grown up and returned to claim, Sarah understood that redemption was not a destination, but a daily choice. Every morning, she could choose to be defined by her worst moment, or she could choose to let that moment teach her how to create better ones. The choice was hers, and she had finally learned to choose wisely.